Hello. This is a short sermonette that I wanted to give about a parable in the Bible, which is always interested to me. Fortunately, this one is not a parable which people have had difficulty understanding. Every time I've heard somebody preach on it or talk to it, they've given a correct interpretation. But there's one aspect of it that I wanted to bring out a little bit that would actually enhance the meaning, I thought, or at least it would for me. And so this is the parable of the unforgiving servant. And I'll go ahead and read it. We find it in Matthew 18. Beginning in verse 23, it says, Therefore the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. Therefore, when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, Pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, Have patience with me, and I will pay you. He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. Jesus told this parable and answered questions about how much should you forgive or how often should you forgive. And when people preach on this subject, they always talk about the master is God who's forgiven us greatly, and then the fellow servant, what he owes us is not very much, and so we should certainly be willing to forgive our fellow servants. We should certainly forgive other people, and that is entirely correct. But I just wanted to bring out one point about it, which I hadn't heard discussed, at least in a sermon I hadn't. And it's just that I'm always interested in numbers. And so I wanted to look at the subject of the numbers. This here is a picture of a denarius with the image of Tiberius Caesar on it. Tiberius was the Caesar during Jesus's ministry. A denarius was a silver coin set equal to 10 pounds of bronze. They had smaller coins in that day, but the denarius was a common coin, 10 pounds of bronze, so pretty significant money. It was the common one day's wage for an average worker. The salary of a Roman soldier at this time was set to 225 denarii per year. So, just as a side note, the Roman soldiers didn't make anything more than an average worker, at least not in terms of their salary. Now, this is a picture of a talent. A talent was a Roman gold bar weighing about 72 pounds. And it was the largest monetary unit they used in the Roman Empire. But most significantly, the value of a talent was set to 6,000 denarii. And if you're good at numbers, you're already beginning to calculate that's an extremely large amount of money. But let's put it into today's terms. A denarius is one day's wage. In modern terms, if you had a $50,000 annual salary, that would come to $200 per day if you worked 5 days a week. Now, I know there's plenty of people who make less than $50,000, but I know there's also plenty of people who make more than that. And so 50,000 is, at least that's an amount that we can imagine people making. So let's just assume that that's our average salary, $200 per day. So 6,000 times 200. Remember, 6,000 denarii and a talent. So 6,000 times 200 is 1.2 million. So one talent is $1.2 million. And that makes 10,000 talents, $12 billion. Remember, the man he owed 10,000 talents. The servant owed his master $12 billion. Now, of course, that is a completely unimaginable sum. I doubt that any individual in history has ever gone that far in debt. Somebody had calculated at this time that they figured that 10,000 talents was roughly the annual gross domestic product of the Galilee region of Israel in 1 year. So there's no way that, in realistic money terms, the guy could have even run up a debt like that. But if he ever did have that much of a debt, there's no way that anyone could ever even begin to come close to the debt being repaid. And often in Jesus's parables, there's an element of extravagance in it. And this is certainly one of them. The servant owed his master such an extravagant amount of money that there was no possibility that it could ever be repaid. Remember, this is what Jesus is using in the parable to describe the debt that we owe to God, the sin debt. So let's come back to the denarius, $200 per day. 100 denarii would be $20,000. Now, his fellow servant owed him $20,000. Now, sometimes we think when we read this parable that what his fellow servant owed him was just trivial. It's like if I let somebody borrow $1 so they could get a Coke out of the Coke machine, and then the next day I asked and they didn't have the money, and I got really mad at them for not having the money, $1, I would be a jerk. And so sometimes we read it like that, but that's not the right way to read it. In this case, the fellow servant owed him $20,000. That's real money. For most of us, that's a meaningful hurt if we're not going to get it back. So, it may not be a life changer, but that is significant, meaningful debt. And that's the kind of figure that Jesus used to describe the forgiveness that we're supposed to have for one another. We're supposed to forgive one another when we have something they've meaningfully wronged us. It's not something we can just excuse because someone bumps into you and they say, "Excuse me," and we say, "That's okay," because it didn't really hurt. This is an amount of money that really does hurt, but we're expected to forgive it anyway. So the conclusion is the forgiveness of our debt by God is unimaginably great. And we are expected to forgive others meaningful debts. So that's this sermon. That's the lesson on